morning, everybody, and welcome to Behavioral Science. Are there better ways to influence humans so that the culture thrives? I've been so excited for this panel. I'm so excited for this panel. I actually stumbled over the name of this panel because on the prep call, I was left with the impression that we could talk about this topic for easily a half a day. So I'm delighted to be joined by a wonderful panel. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on resumes because we're all online and everybody can find everybody. But Maryam Hussain is with us from EY, Katie Lawler from U.S. Bank, and Matt Solomon from AT&T. Thank you guys so much for taking some time for this conversation.
Thank you, Erica.
You're welcome. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we kick off. We will be posting for this panel in particular a resources sidebar. So Katie and Matt and Maryam have been kind enough to give recommendations of additional things you can go and read if you are particularly interested in this topic. So please do check it out. It's a wonderful compilation of things. Some I've read, some I haven't read, and we're really delighted to be able to bring that to you. Also, we are going to be using the chat function to answer questions about today's discussion. So go ahead and use that Q&A chat function to post your questions about our conversation. We'll do our best to answer as many of them as we possibly can over the course of the time we have here today. So behavioral science, we have a lot of the terms in our nomenclature already. Nudge theory, cognitive bias, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of doing traditional introductions, what I'd really love to hear from each of you is what drew you to this particular topic in the first place. So Marianne, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, you've had a long career in forensics and done a lot of work for a lot of clients around the globe. What drew you to behavioral science in that particular context?
So my perspective is from spending over 20 years of my professional life investigating large-scale fraud and corruption around the world. I'll tell you a very short story. I have this very clear memory of the day I came back from maternity leave in 2017, and the headlines in the UK press were around the biggest retailer in the UK, Tesco, having been fined and just reached a settlement with the Serious Fraud Office around accounting manipulation around rebates. And that was particularly salient for me because the day when I left to go on maternity leave a year earlier, the regulatory news was Monsanto having just settled with the SEC around accounting manipulation to do with rebates. And when I started out my career as a junior investigator over 20 years ago in the early 2000s, I spent 6 months traveling around Europe investigating accounting manipulation, in particular to do with rebates for Goodyear, which results in accounting restatement. So I tell that story to say, of course, there's been an enormous amount of positive change during the past 20 years in terms of our public discourse around ethics and compliance. But there are also recurring patterns of misconduct or unethical behavior that we keep failing to prevent or detect early, despite all of that effort. And what became evident to me through my practical experience was that it's clear that a lot of behavior is not driven by information or persuasion, but it's about the environment in which people find themselves. And by changing that environment, we can change the way in which choices are made. We can transform that final decision. So in order to understand the principles of behavioral science, to understand more about human behavior, I went back to university to study for a master's in behavioral science. And now with my team, we use these principles to support our clients in the way they design their ethics and compliance.
Can't wait to dive into that a little bit more. Katie, you come to this particular topic from the perspective of employee relations, human resources, and the ethics office at U.S. Bank. Can you talk a little bit about what that journey was like to you and sort of how you came to the place that you are now?
Sure, Erica. My background is as an employment lawyer and an HR leader, and then an ethics leader. And so I've spent my entire professional career thinking about why employees do the wrong thing. And as Maryam said, it's so rarely a failure to have the right policies, the right rules. It's about the environment and it's about the culture of the organization. I took my current role which was to build the standalone ethics office at the bank in January of 2017, when our industry was really reeling from a pretty significant scandal around sales practices. And when you look at what happened in that situation, there's been a lot written about it, but it really came down to the culture of the organization and the environment. And what I think about is our employees know what's really going on. How do we make sure that information gets to leaders who are removed from it and who are biased to think well of the organization? I remember at my very first Global Ethics Summit listening to Alex Dmitriev, I believe, from GE, and he said, senior leaders are so invested in the organization that it's often hard for them to hear and believe that something's wrong, that it's not the way they believe it to be. And so as I think about that, how do I help leaders have an open mind? How do I help leaders manage their own biases to believe things to be a certain way so that our employees can have a voice? And so I came to it from the perspective of, we talk about having a speak up culture. I need us to have a listen up culture. I need our leaders to be armed and prepared to listen. And so for me, it was all about psychological safety, and it continues to be all about psychological safety. But again, it goes back to, it's the environment that people are in that is going to dictate how they behave, just as Maryam said. So very similar.
Matt, flipping the question around for you, because you're the cognitive psychologist on the panel. How did you come from that discipline into compliance?
That's a great question, Erica. And I thought long and hard about, the different events throughout my life that led me from point A to point B. Because as we all talk about culture, something that we focus on in behavioral science and in cognitive science is what creates culture. So thinking about how to define it is important, but what drives it? How does it get there? And so for me, that piece is really understanding why people do the things they do, why they think the things they think, and what part of their perception creates their own version of reality. So once you unlock that, you can start to nudge it in a given direction or understand it so that you can put proper controls in. I know we said policy probably isn't the problem, but we'll get into that later and how that can help guide your employees in certain ways that they approach it, for example, that I think might help make a policy more or less effective. And it's that deep understanding of just the human mind and how it functions that gives us a little bit of an edge.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. Maryam, I'm going to start with you. During the course of the prep, what you called real prevention on the prep call, you've spent a lot of time thinking about that aspect of it. How are you actually advising clients to think about behavioral science principles in their system design, right? So what sort of advice do you give to clients to say, this is the way we know people work, this is how you should think about the real prevention aspect of things?
Yeah, I think the reality is that we need formal systems, but formal systems only go so far. So we really need to understand the informal systems that are in play in an organization and understand their impact. So where in our organization, the rules are to be ethical, but the incentive is to achieve results. And as long as you achieve the results, no one really looks too much at the process of which the results were achieved. We ask people to follow the rules and give them clear incentives not to, or sometimes even make it impossible. We did an investigation about 18 months ago, which was a large-scale outsourcing company. And what they were doing was they were signing contracts which required a certain number of calls to be answered in a day, and that number was going up and up. And the call center providers, call center staff simply didn't have the capacity to meet those targets. And yet their bonuses were determined on individual and group performance and how many calls they answered. So what did they do? Over time, they were manipulating the numbers, and what that was called was updating the numbers, because ethical misconduct always has a euphemism, because if we saw it for what it was at the time, we wouldn't do it. So I come back to this informal systems and the danger in the blind spots when we fail to see our own ethical gaps and the ethical gaps of those around us. Those people in the call center operators, after they've been doing this for a number of years, they didn't think they were doing anything wrong. It was part of the routine. The numbers got updated according to the contract metrics every month. And the reality is that there are a lot of steps in the slippery slope to serious misconduct. Each of those steps changes us a little and legitimizes the next slightly worse step. So our ethical lines move without us realizing. And that first step, it often starts with a conflict of interest, which is built into the informal systems. So I think as a practical consideration, the question is, where is it in our organization that we do ask people to follow the rules and give them an incentive not to? What do we really reward? Whose behavior, be it individuals or departments, do we never question? Because these are the areas that we should look into first, because the risk is we have blind spots in these areas. And whilst the formal systems look like they're covering everything and every eventuality, the informal systems are failing to look at these areas. So I would always say, if you're looking at a compliance program beyond the formal systems, it has to be really tailored to the circumstances of that organization and looking at the areas which may be blind spots for that organization and in that context.
Matt, I see both Matt and Katie, you guys are both nodding your heads. Matt, I'm going to start with you. Any thoughts on that, the formal informal system distinction that Maryam set up?
Oh my goodness, yes. There was so much in there, Maryam. We could unpack that for the rest of the hour. I think, our formal systems at AT&T are excellent. We're an operating company and we're very good at understanding what you need to know to be able to function properly in your role. The trick is the informal systems. And I'd like to talk for a minute about what happens when you are at a company, when you have so many distinct operating units, right? So there are people at my company that run the gamut, from folks that are outside, working on our network infrastructure, to people sitting in Washington, D.C., inside the belt, talking about policy and law, and everything in between, right? So I believe, like Maryam stated, that in order for the informal system to work, you need to meet people where they are. So, how you do that in a company our size can be challenging. And that's what we're focused on right now. Because, for example, tone messaging, we all know what that is. Right? For those of us, participating in the conference, tone messaging typically focuses on tone at the top, right? Is the senior leadership band speaking about ethics and integrity regularly, prolifically? Are they making that point heard? Very important. I think it is necessary, but not sufficient, right? Spoken like a true cognitive scientist. Right? I think as you start to propagate that information throughout the organization, you have to really pay close attention to the business units that you are trying to reach. So you would not approach a sales organization. And in Maryam's example, Katie talked about it too. These are folks who have immense goals. Their KPIs are strict and rigid, and they fight every day to meet and exceed those. And typically at many companies, those are attached to some sort of compensation benefit, right? We are the same. So you would speak to that organization very differently than you would, say, an ops team or a marketing group or a technology team, right? Which has a very different set of, we'll call it, Maryam, I'm not going to directly quote you here because I can't pull it out of my head, but it was something about that slippery slope, right? You don't just wake up one morning and decide to do something unethical. It builds and builds and builds, right? And that builds differently in different organizations. So to me, that's the power of the informal system. The formal system is rigid and structured. It protects us. It protects our customers. The informal system makes that real.
Katie, anything to add there?
Well, I want to go back to what Maryam said too about sort of the how, because I think it's so important to focus not just on whether someone achieves their goals, but do they do it the right way? And that's one of the things we've been really successful at influencing at our company is we have a whole new performance management program that employees they get rated on whether or not they achieve their goals. They get equally rated on a completely separate rating on how did they do it? Did they do it the right way? And because I think so often it's the lapse is we have this great performer, and I think you said it, Maryam, like nobody bothers to look under the rug there or that unit that's always producing to see are they doing it the right way. And so if you can make a point to equally focus on not just what did they do, but did they do it the right way? I always, when I talk to groups, I say, Are you promoting someone who got great results but left a lot of roadkill in their wake? Then that tells me what you really value. And I think it's where the actions and the words need to match. And I think what you said, Matt, about tone at the top, tone is not just the words, it's the behaviors, that whether or not those behaviors align to it. So one of the things we focus on a lot is, do the words and the actions match, or the inactions, because it's the things that we tolerate so often that get us in trouble, and that don't match what we're saying. And it sends the message then to employees that this is what we really care about. You can get away with this.
So Katie, I'm going to preempt what I know is going to be a chat question coming in, because every time we ever talk about performance evaluations and having the how you did it component in there, the immediate follow-up question is always, how do I not make that totally subjective, right? If I'm a manager and I've hired my team or I've inherited my team, I think they're all good people, right? So the process of crafting the how questions on a performance evaluation is so challenging, because you can't just say, is this a good person? Did they live our values, right? Because the manager is going to say, of course they did. All my people are great people, right? How do you actually get managers to do that in a way that matters?
What we did was we identified 6 what we call leadership core behaviors, and then what we did is we took those 6 behaviors and we mapped out, what does that look like if you're an individual contributor, because an individual contributor is also a leader. What does it look like if you are a manager of people or a manager of managers? And try to get really specific. I mean, so for ethics and integrity, one of the questions was, at an individual contributor level, did you speak up? If you're a manager, did you foster a speak up environment? And if you're a leader, it's, did you cultivate and encourage and reward a speak up environment? So we try to be pretty specific, but we mapped it out into a sort of 6 behavior matrix, and then tried to make it role specific.
Yeah, because I think that's one of the critical pieces, that I have seen when I've seen it done well with the companies that we work with, is there's no one size fits all, you did it the right way description for every role in your organization, particularly not, if you're an organization the size of any one of the 3 companies, the 3 organizations you guys work with. You have to think about, what does this look like in this particular job function? What does this look like in this particular role level? What does this look like? Doing it the right way for sales is going to be very different than doing it the right way, for somebody who's running a team of guys who are out reconnecting wires to poles, right? Those are very different skill sets.
Well, and like Matt, we have people running check sorting machines, because some people still write checks, not many, but we're running check sorting machines in an ops center, all the way up to people doing, fixed income and high finance on Wall Street, and everything in between. So similar to Matt, we have to be really thinking about where we are, and then add on to that the number of physical locations that we maintain. Because you think about the culture, every branch, and we have thousands of branches, every branch has its own culture, right, and its own leadership style. So being able to be very specific to and relevant to someone who is working in an ops center, a call center, a physical branch on Wall Street in DC with lobbyists, you're absolutely right. You have to be relevant to those roles, because it's not one size fits all.
Yep.
And to build on that.
Sorry, go ahead, Maryam.
I'm just going to make a comment, a specific example, and it comes down to where are our organizations most vulnerable. So where are people could be really caught between a conflict of interest. So this is an example from a financial services organization where there's a conflict between taking on clients, which might be really high net worth clients, but then due diligence finds out that there are issues, ethical issues around that. So do you get credit for turning down a client when you were quite far down the line, having found out there was an ethical issue? So it's not going to get reflected in your sales or customer targets, but you can demonstrate that you took the right decision at the right time. It comes down to identify the specific points when people feel the most pressure and conflict.
I think that's right. And that's a great example of those sort of competing interests that you identified earlier, Maryam, because that salesperson wants to onboard that client.
Absolutely. And I think, and we deal with that all the time. Our businesses are so different, but so similar in that way. It's fascinating. One thing that I think we're taking for granted in this conversation that I want to highlight is we're talking about rewarding ethical behavior. Think of the shift between rewarding ethical behavior versus the more antiquated punitive way of looking at compliance, where we are punishing unethical behavior, right? I just, listening to Maryam and Katie speak about the programs at their organizations really highlights that, and it puts a smile on my face. Because, you know, as a cognitive scientist, I can tell you, you will be far more successful in ingraining that behavior and, you know, allowing that behavior to generalize into other areas if you have a reward structure as opposed to a punishment structure. So I just wanted a little plug there for reward structure.
And Matt, I think that's a really good point, right? Because as all three of you have mentioned, it's the informal signals that we send to employees about what really matters, right? So if the highest performing salesperson keeps getting rewarded over and over and over again, and that person, everybody knows that person is a huge, I won't swear on camera at the GES, but it's not exactly living our values.
They have some issues. How's that?
They have some issues. If they are, as Katie said, leaving roadkill in their wake, right? They're churning through inside salespeople because nobody can handle working with this person, right? But management keeps turning a blind eye because the numbers are great. Guess what, right? That's the behavior that people are going to model. It's part of the reason why, our culture data shows that the single most influential person on an employee's behavior is their manager, because that's the person I look to say, what does success look like here? Right? How do I go, if I'm a teller at the U.S. bank branch at the Safeway in, down the street from my house, and I want to become branch manager, it doesn't matter what the CEO is telling me. It matters what my branch manager is telling me, right? That's the person whose behavior I'm going to emulate. And so, Katie, I wanted to start with you because you mentioned during the introduction that for you, it's all about psychological safety and, sort of that individual people leader. So why psychological safety? How has that particular research influenced the way you talk to managers about their role at the bank?
Mm-hmm. I really got interested in it at the outset when I was setting up the program. Previously, it had been embedded within employee relations. And so my charge was to take and create an independent global ethics office. And I went out and I benchmarked and I talked to lots of companies and went to lots of conferences. And I had led the employee relations function for many years, so it wasn't foreign to me. But what I heard so often was that reference to, you've got to build a speak up culture. But I look around and I see how often people hold back because they're afraid. And then I read Amy Edmondson's work, and I read her book, The Fearless Organization, which brought it all together for me. And really thinking about how do we prevent issues, because almost never does an issue come out. I mean, the issues don't come out of nowhere. People know what's going on, and they don't have that channel to speak up. And I've seen it play out. I mean, I've seen it play out in my current company. I've seen it play out in other organizations where people aren't listening. And so what I realized to me was, it's not about telling employees to speak up, because that puts the onus on the employee to have courage, right? It puts all the onus on the employee. You need to speak up. The onus needs to be on the company and on its leaders to listen and to take action. So we adopted this mantra: speak up, listen up, follow up. And that's what we talk about, because if an employee goes to their manager and they don't get a productive response, they're never going to go back. And they're going to tell their coworkers, don't bother. And your speak up culture in that group is dead. So we really, psychological safety resonated with me so strongly, because I see people, and I've experienced it. That meeting you go to, where you walk out of it and you think, oh, should have kept my mouth shut. That's what I don't want people to feel. And I think we've had pockets in our own company of where it's very hard to deliver bad news. Mm-hmm. But I also, the other reason it really resonates with me is I think about what businesses are going through right now, and the digital disruption and the change in consumer behavior. And I know it's affecting you, Matt, as well, but in banking, we're going through a lot of disruption. We have a lot of fintechs, coming into our space. We have huge regulatory changes, consumer behavior is changing, shifting to digital. And we need our people to feel like they have a voice, to be more innovative, to not be afraid of failure, to try new things, and to tell us when we're getting it wrong. So psychological safety doesn't just prevent us from having a big ethical lapse, it actually helps us perform better. And then I marry it up with our efforts on DEI. And it's really the other side of the coin of inclusion, is making sure, and this is where I partner closely with our DEI team, because inclusion and ethics go hand in hand. It's all about making sure employees have a voice and know that their voice is welcome. So that's what drew me to it. And so I spend a lot of my time talking to leaders about behaviors that they can employ to send the signal and to make it the norm to have the hard conversations. So I do workshops all over the company every week, talking to leaders about how can I behave in a way when I am interacting with my team to make it clear that I welcome what you have to say. I know everything isn't going to be green on the heat map. I know sometimes things go wrong. I know sometimes projects get off track. I know sometimes people make mistakes, and we have to look at that as a learning opportunity, rather than a blame and shame opportunity. And so trying to teach them behaviors they can employ. So that's where it comes down to it for me. And it's really kind of become the cornerstone of the work that we're focused on my team.
Matt, I noticed, again, a lot of nodding.
Yeah.
And one of the things I particularly like about the way Katie frames that is she's so, Katie, you're so right. Speak up culture doesn't end at with the ethics issue, right? If you've got a real speak up culture, you've got new product ideas, you've got client concerns, you've got, hey, this project going off track. You've got, I didn't like the way Matt spoke to me in that meeting, right? Like you've got the gamut of.
But you've also got, hey, here's a new way of doing something.
Here's a new way of doing something, right? Exactly. But you have to have a manager who's open to that kind of dialogue and willing to take the time to do it, which, given everything we ask managers to do these days is not necessarily the easiest thing. So, Matt, sorry, I didn't mean to take us too far down a rabbit hole there. But I'm curious for your thoughts, examples of how you guys think about this inside of AT&T. Sure. And then I'll turn to Maryam for her thoughts as well.
Absolutely. And Katie, thank you for sharing the psychological safety best practices you have. I'm going to plagiarize that from you, but I promise I will credit you for it.
We've got examples of that, Matt, by the way, on the Bella Member Hub. For anybody who's listening in that is a Bella member, go check out some of the stuff that Katie's been so kind to share with the community.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we will definitely do that. I think I approached it differently. I will say, in an open and honest communication here, I thought about it as an incentive. So for those of you who are familiar with the HBO miniseries Chernobyl, the series opens with a line from Legasov, who is the chief scientist, saying, "What is the cost of lies?" Right. So I approached it this way when speaking to our senior leaders. What does a non-transparent organization cost you? And it isn't a philosophical conversation. It has actual black ink ramifications. If your people are unable to express to their leaders, to their leaders, to their leaders, to you, some issues or pain points that they're experiencing, you are no longer running the most efficient business unit that you could be running. So that incurs a cost. But I love how Katie was talking about, this concept of psychological safety. It is important when receiving feedback, for example, to say, thank you. That's really the only appropriate response, right? Thank you for giving me that feedback. I hear you. That active listening. And I think, we suffer a lot from that. We are an old company and we're an operating company, and we're very driven toward trying to understand the root cause of issues, but it can stop there. One of the things that we've done at AT&T to shift that mindset is create a win as one culture. So we have 4 cultural pillars. Win as one is one of them. And what that has done, or what it is starting to do, is transition our people from defining their success based solely on their contribution to a project or program to what is that project or program doing for the larger AT&T family. And I think that has been a key component to that. Because, to your point, Katie, if people are receiving feedback or criticism as an attack because they're defining their success as the work they put in, the discretionary effort they made for that project, you're always going to have a non-safe environment, right? Because there are always going to be people feel like they're on the other side of an argument as opposed to contributing to a discussion. So that win as one culture is starting to take hold, and it's not about what I have done for my team, for my organization, but it's about what my effort was intended to do for a larger group of employees, for our business. And I think that's been a key component to creating that psychological safety and moving the onus off of the individual onto more of a collective group.
I like that.
Maryam, thoughts from your perspective, either from the clients you've worked with, or other examples where you've seen of the idea of this sort of psychological safety, attitude of gratitude for bad news, failure response analysis.
Yeah, and Matt and Katie framed it in this broader sense, because actually you want people to speak up, and that speaking up can be about all sorts of things to make the organization better. I will just make an observation on in a narrower context, which is around misconduct, because always when something has gone badly wrong, all the cases that we deal with are of course different, but the question is the same: is why wasn't this prevented or detected earlier? Right. And often part of the answer is that people did see it, but they quite often didn't see it for what it was. And so I think a couple of kind of observations, that part of the reason sometimes people don't speak up is that genuinely they don't see things for what they are. So they don't see it as something that needs to be spoken about or reported. And one thing I saw, one initiative in an organization, which I thought was really interesting, was actively getting feedback from new employees a month in. So they've gone through all the training when they've been told what the values of the organization, behaviors, etc. But a month in, they're still new enough. And the question to them is, are you seeing anything that's surprising you, given all the training that you've just had and everything you just heard about what we stand for? Because they're new enough to perhaps see things for what they are. The other observation, especially we talked about how, large global organizations, and of course the context and culture is different in different parts of the organization, and in particular the country cultures can be different. So in wanting to encourage individuals to speak up, really thinking about the values that are predominant in that country and in that business culture in order to speak to those values. So for example, if there is a very strong culture of loyalty to the local business and the local context, a message that's driven from very far away from headquarters with a good intent of asking people to speak up or to share concerns is unlikely to be speaking to those values, because those values are more sort of locally focused. So it comes back to really thinking about the behavior we want to encourage and what is it that will be best received by the people who are the recipients of that message.
Which again, sort of circles back around, Maryam, to one of the points that you all were making earlier, which is this idea that you need to really understand who your employees are across the globe, where they are, and what their individual trigger points might be, right? So I think that's the thing that I find so interesting about some of the influence that behavioral science has had on this particular space, is this idea that, it's you have to put the work in to contextualize the messaging, right? And you need to think about what's the right modality, who's the right leader, right? Because not everything is going to be, Katie, your compliance ride-along videos are terrific, right? If you guys haven't seen these, I highly recommend checking them out. It's a takeoff on comedians getting coffee in cars, and Katie just chats with a leader in the car about some compliance or some ethics related issue, but that's going to resonate with a group who knows who Jerry Seinfeld is, right? In a lot of ways, and it may not resonate with somebody who's more accustomed to getting things via TikTok. And so really thinking about who are the people I'm trying to reach, and what is the message I'm trying to get to them. And it's an act of contextualization that takes commitment. And so, Matt, I wanted to, one of the things I think that AT&T is doing that's so interesting is you guys are marrying behavioral science with data analytics, right? And you're really using data to drive a lot of the ways in which you think about contextualizing your message. So can you talk a little bit about what that partnership was like, and sort of how you guys think about the data usage piece?
Yeah, I'll spike it up, and then maybe we can get some questions or comments between us going, because I think it's an interactive conversation, right? I am a data scientist, as well as being a cognitivist. So the conjunction is kind of me and some of my peers and folks around the company. But we look at all sorts of different aspects of data and try to pull them together. So for example, I think the most obvious for this forum would be employee self-report violation data. It's something we all have. and it's a program that we all are compelled to maintain and monitor by the Department of Justice. I think it's important to acknowledge that. But what do you do with it, right? So imagine joining that with employee feedback data, whether it be from surveys, our Ethisphere ethical culture survey, excellent survey, whether it be from our own internal instruments or from employee focus groups, and then from employee demographic and characteristic data. So if you think about merging all of those things together, you can start to generate what I would call an employee profile. Apparently, that is now anachronistic. The buzzword is, and this just flew out of my head, personas, right? We have a persona. I once said caricature, that apparently was going in the wrong direction, so personas. But they are designed to say, you know, this group of employees, this role, this set of responsibilities, this business unit has these particular behavioral markers. They have this type of employee, and they react to our various compliance controls, processes, policies, and systems this way, right? So you think about contrasting an ops team, you know, and how they look at our policies. Well, they probably know what they are, right? Because they're ops people. So we can actually look at their discretionary effort. Everyone takes the training, but did they go back? Do they go to some of our websites? You know, we have all these neat APIs that we can look at who's looking at what and how long they spend looking at it and say, ooh, that is an employee persona of someone who's very informed and very operationally directed. You could find that organization or that pocket of people inside of an organization. To contrast that, what about folks who learn more organically? Think about learning styles, right? That you would discuss in pedagogy and in academy, right? How do you reach folks who learn more organically? I think you made the point, Erica, like TikTok. You know, right. We do not have or use TikTok, but something along those lines.
I saw my first compliance TikTok. I don't recommend it. It's not there yet. Maybe that's a different panel discussion, yep. But you know, employees who learn more organically, they learn from experience, they learn from, you know, storytelling and things like that. We can see that, you know, because they don't go look at those systems, but they do still understand what our mission is and how they can engage in it. So meeting people where they are through data analytics can really help drive it. The last thing I'll say before we just chat about that is statistics approximate truth. They are not truth, right? So they can get you started in a given direction. And you can go, okay, instead of looking at 100 possible avenues, I can narrow it down to 5. But it still takes us. It still takes people to go and do. I think one of you said, you know, it takes a commitment to understanding your people and understanding how to make that messaging stick. That piece cannot be substituted for just data that tells you, you know, this is a group of people, talk to them this way, and you're done. So you have to go and still see them, but it helps focus that conversation. Matt, before I turn to Maryam and Katie to bring them both into this piece of the process for their thoughts, I'm curious. I just want to touch on one thing. You know, AT&T has obviously grown a lot by acquisition and occasionally divestiture, right? But there's been a lot of sort of in and out movement for the company. How do you all think about the work you are doing as it pertains to the acquisition and integration process, right? So what would be your advice to somebody who's listening to this panel saying, that's great, you know, but as soon as I finish understanding who my pockets are, I have a new pocket, right? Where, you know, we're acquiring so fast that I can't keep up.
So that is a great question, Erica. I will say the first thing is never get comfortable. If you're comfortable and you say, I understand this now, so we're good, we don't have to look at it anymore, you're probably not right. It is constantly in flux, whether you're buying and selling other corporations or whether you or just have, you know, your people are changing every day. They change every day. So that would be number one. You have to be okay with the fact that the research you did today may not be relevant 6 months from now. And that's okay, right? It was relevant at this moment. When acquiring different companies, again, due diligence. You have to understand who they are and how they function. And my piece of sage advice, if I could give it, was spend time with them and understand how they operate. Because if you try to fit them into the mold of the parent corporation, you know, or the acquiring corporation, you're going to have a bad time. right? They don't appreciate that. So just really understanding, where they are. I think back to when we acquired AppNexus, right? Very different company than we were used to dealing with. And so how did we attempt to make that smooth? Get to know the folks over there, go up to New York or, meet them where they are, shake their hand. It's obviously pre-COVID, talk about, how they like to work, how they communicate with their people, and start to build that into the plan. And learn, by the way. I mean, it would be foolish to assume that just because you're the company that is acquiring another company, that you've got everything figured out and you're doing it the right way.
Absolutely. Maryam, your thoughts on the data piece, the acquisition piece, and any and all of the above? Yeah,
I'd just say that thing about learning, that should be set in gold. That always, the moment you think you've got things figured out, is the moment you should be worried. A couple of thoughts. First one, on Matt alluded to it in terms of the kind of the quantitative data. There's always a challenge around how do you get enough quantitative data so that it's statistically significant, but together with enough qualitative context so you can draw meaning from it. And one of the approaches that I've seen and we actually used with our clients is an approach which has been developed by Dave Snowden. It's a framework called the Cynefin framework, where you can acquire thousands of stories, so at a scale, across an organization. And one of the things that I like about that method of data collection is the questions that people are asked. It's not obvious what the answer is. So, for example, and the answers are not graded. So, for example, they're required to be put on a triad of different characteristics. So, for example, it might be in a pharmaceutical company where the question is, for the sales force, can you describe a situation where you experience a tension between different parameters? The parameters could be performance, following the rules, or patient well-being. Now, none of those are wrong answers. And it makes you think, and you tell your story and you put it somewhere on the triangle and you replicate that across the workforce. And the benefit of that sort of data is it gives you an idea of the landscape of attitudes of where people are at. And there's a benefit to that because attitudes are lead indicators and compliance is a lag indicator. So the point around that is combining qualitative data at a scale, at a quantitative scale in which we can draw some conclusions and take some actions, and that being another piece of data that you can use along with others to inform decision making. I had one other observation which is specifically related to the point that you made around acquisitions. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me of a sort of an excellent rule of thumb, which is in the book Blind Spots, which is one of the resources that I found really useful by Max Bazerman and Pembronsel. And they have this rule of thumb of look in your organization, wherever it may be, where you have high uncertainty, where people experience high uncertainty, time pressure, and are isolated. And you often find that in situations where there's been acquisitions. But to Katie's point earlier, what have we done over the past, what's happened over the past year? What have our people experienced across our organizations? Uncertainty, time pressure, and isolation. So the relevance of that to the data is to then think about what could have gone wrong and to put some signals and sensors in the data to see whether there's any indications in the data that that sort of misconduct that you might fear that's actually crystallized.
Yeah. Well, and Maryam, I think, not to take us in too far into what could be an entire other panel discussion, but I think as we look forward, the pandemic has gone on for long enough that we've learned some stuff at this point, right? We've learned good things, we've learned bad things, right? But we've figured out some things that work. And so, the challenge I would make to everybody in the audience is to think about that triad that Maryam just outlined and ask yourself, as we move into the summer, as we move into the fall, some people are going to go back to the office, some people are going to stay at home. How do we think about that triad and set up structures and skill sets that will allow some of those pieces of pressure to dissipate a little bit, right? Because, one of the things I'm fond of saying is we all know that most of the people who are promoted to be managers are not promoted to be managers because they're good managers, right? They were promoted to be managers because they were good at the job they were doing before. And if you, particularly in what is likely for a lot of us to be a hybrid in-person remote working team, how do you set managers up in that context for success? Right. So I think that's one of the questions I'm asking myself a lot. I would love to hear if any of you guys have the answer to that one. Or the beginning of an answer to that one.
I don't know that I have the answer. I use a similar construct as Maryam. I talk about fear, pressure, and isolation as the three key risks that this current environment really has brought in terms of people making good ethical decisions, right? And what fear does to us, pressure. I actually think the pandemic, if you look at the fraud triangle, the pandemic is actually both, in some ways, is pressure and rationalization, because you can rationalize these aren't normal times. Yeah. So I use that framework a lot when I'm talking to people to help them be vigilant about really focusing on creating opportunities for connection and those opportunities for people to actually be able to speak to you when it feels like it has to be so formal right now, and you don't have those casual water cooler drop-ins. So I think helping leaders be very intentional about structuring their days for that interaction with their teams, no matter where they are, is so important. But that's like the tiniest tip of an iceberg there.
Yeah.
Just to build on that point about being intentional, I think one of the things that's happened during the pandemic because of the remoteness is that being really conscious that you have to be really clear and explicit around your communications and communicate exactly what you mean and what are you asking for, and really getting trying to get the same direct feedback. And I think this is one of the things that could be a benefit ongoing for us to be really mindful of our communications that we make. Are we clear enough? Do we really understand how it's being received? And do we seek enough of the right sort of feedback to be able to act on it?
So to me then, Maryam, is that a dialogue with our teams about active listening? Is that feedback loop? What's sort of the behavioral sciences principle that we can pull on that piece in particular, that mindful interaction?
I think the risk is you communicate, you think it's been received and it hasn't. We did a survey going back 6 months now, a global fraud survey, and it showed this massive gap, for example, between employees saying they received messages or they heard messages around ethical conduct, and the leadership saying, but we've been talking about this.
Right.
So it's about thinking which parts of the organization are you not actively reaching out to and hearing from, and being deliberate about doing that and not assuming just because you communicated.
Yeah, it's not enough just to push it out, right? As compliance professionals, we're very good. We push it out. It's out there. We just it's in the universe. What do you mean you haven't seen it, right? And Matt, this goes back to your point about data, right? I mean, the fortunate place we're in right now is a lot of our organizations are set up that if you ask the right question about the modality that you're using, you can figure out, maybe not down to the individual, but, whether or not they heard it or they interacted with it or not, but at least to, the persona, whether or not they would have been likely to have interacted with that particular information, right?
Yeah.
The follow-up question to that, of course, is, did they actually ingest the guidance, right? And I think that's
the tough one.
You push it out. Did they interact with it? Okay, have I actually changed their behavior, right? And that right. Last piece is the piece that we're all still working on in so many ways.
Can I add, Erica? And I love please. That point. And I think discretionary effort is the way to find that out, right? And it has to be the sole employee discretion, right? It has to be, and something measurable, of course.
Right.
But going back to the question about the pandemic, I wanted to get everybody's response first, because I'm gonna throw a wrench in the works here. From my research and analytics at AT&T, I have found that there is almost no difference between the way we conducted business before and the way we conduct it now. People were distracted and multitasking in meetings in person. They do that now, in meetings over the phone or on WebEx. They weren't co-located with their teammates or supervisors then. They're not now, right? So I struggle in talking about this to say, well, what is really the difference? Or is it a perception of a difference that's maybe, you know, highlighting something that isn't really there? But topic for a later discussion, perhaps.
Topic for a later discussion, without question. Well, Katie, Matt, and Maryam, thank you guys so much for the time. Thank you all for listening in. Definitely check out the resources sidebar for a lot of the guidance that the panel has pulled together of different things that you can take a look at if you want to take a deeper dive into this topic. And I would say, you know, the interest level in this particular topic is enough. That this is a conversation we're just going to keep on having. So thank you guys for kicking us off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.